Hello, and welcome to the Wealthy Woman Lawyer podcast. We believe all women lawyers deserve to be wealthy women lawyers. Our mission is to provide thought-provoking, powerful, and practical information to help you in creating your own sustainable, wealth-generating law firm without overwork or overwhelm, so you can live your best life. I'm your host, Davina Frederick, and I'm so excited for you to meet our guest today. So let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Wealthy Woman Lawyer podcast. I'm your host, Davina Frederick, the creator of Wealthy Woman Lawyer podcast and also the founder of Wealthy Woman Lawyer, which is a coaching business that helps women law firm owners scale their law firm businesses to and through $1 million with total ease. And today I am super excited for today's guest because this topic we're going to be talking about is hot, hot, hot. It is something that so many people in the nation and so many women law firm owners are dealing with, and it can be a real impediment to wealth unless we deal with it. So we're going to put it on the table and talk about it today, and that is student loan debt. And I'm excited about my guest because she is truly an expert in this area. She has more than 30 years experience as a lawyer. She graduated from Stetson Law in 1992. And she actually worked for Sallie Mae and ECMC and other student loan servicers before opening her own law firm, which she did in, I think, 1995. Is that correct, Christie? And yeah, and so she helps her clients deal with consumer debt, so bankruptcy, student loan debt, all of the things that factor into getting out of debt, managing debt, and really getting your financial life back on track. So Christie Arkovich, everyone of Arkovich Law, she is in South Tampa. And so I'm really glad she's here today because we're bracing for a hurricane here in Florida. Welcome, Christie.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, Davina.
Yeah. So tell me, you said that you are actually out of the state today, but I assume your team is all batten down the hatches over there in Tampa and preparing for that.
Yeah, we closed tomorrow and the next day, and we've secured our computers and sandbags for our doors and things like that. But I like to joke, I evacuated months ahead of time to Iowa, where I am now.
Very nice. And yeah, and you're in a lovely place. I'm sitting here envying that fireplace that you have behind me. I bet it's really beautiful up there.
It's not quite cold enough to have it on, but it is getting to the 40s in the evening now at night, which is fantastic. I mean, in Florida, it's always hot, so that's one of the reasons I like to get away.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It's a little, we'll have it a little cool here right now, but as soon as that hurricane blows through, it's going to take all the air with it.
Yep.
And probably not great hair days next week with but anyway, let's get on with today's topic and start out by I gave a very brief introduction of you, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about you, your law firm, and how you help your clients?
Sure. Well, when I graduated in 92, it was sort of during a little bit of a recession. And so I had worked for three other law firms for about a couple years before I started my own firm. And one of our clients was a big student loan guarantor. Sallie Mae USA Funds was a company back then. And so I did that work, and that was one client who I took with me when I left because the firm I was with didn't want to have anything to do with student loans. And so what we did it kind of gradually increased to represent ECMC, which is the guarantor of a lot of the older loans, and they're the one that really litigates most of it. So we ran around the state of Florida, and I tried discharge cases for student loans in bankruptcy in Miami and Jacksonville and Orlando and Tampa, and really got my feet wet then. And then after that, I went to a boot camp, I guess, or workshop, you should call it, by Josh Cohen up in Connecticut to kind of learn some of the federal programs because, practicing in bankruptcy, you really didn't know anything about the federal program. So that kind of, clued me in on other options out there. And then it just continued to grow from there. And so when I opened my own practice, I focused on employment law, which was always a true love of mine, and in bankruptcy as well. And for your listeners, the reason I did that combination was because employment law was more attorney intensive and it was more contingency fee. I got paid larger sums at the end of the case, where bankruptcy was more covered the day to day. It was up front. It covered a lot of, took a lot of staff time instead of my time. And so it was a good fit for my firm. I think every firm, it's good to have more than one practice area. because something can happen and it can just wipe out your practice
Mhm.
instantaneously. And
Mhm.
so that was a good fit for a number of years. And then I just kind of moved along and back to student loans when the market was ready for that. It wasn't really ready back then, but clearly in the last 10 years, we've needed some big help with student loans.
Right, absolutely. Was there a change, in the law at some point, or has it always sort of been this way, but it just hasn't been a problem because the amount that people were borrowing was different, or there were more, standards in place, but or was there a shift someplace? So, like, I remember borrowing as an undergrad, way back in the day, and unfortunately, I didn't borrow very much, and, I don't remember as many people struggling with student loan debt in the way that we are today. So can you give us a kind of a little history?
Sure.
'Cause you certainly have, for 30 years, have probably seen a little bit of ebb and flow in this area.
Well, back when I graduated law school in 1991, um, that was exactly the case. I'm an attorney only because of my student loans. So I believe in the program. I think it's very important to have the availability of student loans. But when I graduated, it was a ratio of 1 to 1. In other words, I owed about what my first year's salary was. And it wasn't hard for me to pay that loan. And I paid the loans back in the 10 years or whatnot. And that's the way it was. Everybody had a 10-year time period. But now the ratios aren't 1 to 1 any longer. You usually have someone who isn't able to obtain employment right away, or the ratios are up to 2 to 1 to 8 to 1, where they just really can't repay that.
Mhm.
And I even had a high rate of interest. When we graduated in '80s and '90s from college and law school, the rates of interest were 8%, 12%. I mean, that's high, very high.
Right.
But because the amount we borrowed was so low, it wasn't a problem. Where now, with Parent Plus loans and grad loans, the interest rates are 6.8 to 8.5. You've got private loans that are all over the place. They go up from like 3% to 15% and such. And that ratio is no longer 1 to 1. So it's not really a shift in the legal environment that has gotten to that. It's the tuition costs and the fact that people just can't repay those loans. And so most of our clients nowadays, they want to repay what they borrowed. They understand they signed a contract, they're good with that. What they can't pay is the excessiveness, what it's become, basically. Because with the cost of interest, with the default, which basically adds 25% collection costs on a federal loan, you end up with just something that's unpayable. And we get rid of that excessiveness. And then we try to do it in a way that's tax free, or at least, with the understanding of what the potential tax issue could be.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I've heard so many stories, from women law firm owners who are, by the time they're out on their own and opening their own practice, they have six figures in
Mhm.
debt, and multiple six figures. So $250,000 is kind of a common amount that I hear. I've heard up $350,000. The most I ever heard was $650,000 in student loan because she had gotten multiple degrees and changed careers and things like that. And a lot of women law firm owners, when they go out and start their own business, they're doing it as solos, and they're lucky, they're making $50,000 the first year in just
Mhm.
revenue. Like, so it's not even, it doesn't, the math doesn't even make sense. And that's if they choose to start their own business, or if they feel like they're forced into starting their own business because they can't get a job, which certainly was the case after the 2008 recession. A lot of people did that. And also, even if they do get a job, it depends on the market they're in, because there are a lot of markets that aren't paying those six-figure
Right.
salaries for associates. It's the top 1%. Of the top 1% of law schools, you're going to get these. I have a friend whose son recently graduated from a top law school, top of his class, and he's going to have, a $350,000 salary out of law school for a firm out of New York. But that's a rarity. The majority of lawyers are out there making more regular salaries, unlike what people think they're making. So there's a real disconnect, I think, in understanding of what is going on with the student loan. And I think in general, the public has a real misunderstanding, because a lot of people who are my age are saying, hey, if they didn't borrow money to go to school, or they did and they've long ago paid it back, they're sitting there looking at it going, I don't understand. I paid back my loans how come you aren't able to pay back your loans?
Right. And we deal with that. With private loans, the borrower has to have a co-borrower. And so usually that's a parent or a grandparent. And like you said, most of those grandparents and even parents have paid their own loan back, so they don't get it. But the problem is back then you could pay for a course with a summer waitress job. You can't do that anymore. That part-time work, while it might open your eyes as to what you want to do, maybe open your contacts for networking and externships and things like that, it doesn't pay much. And so with the cost of tuition, it's not really doing that. And that's one of the things that we do is we try to, get that grandparent or parent in on the communications and have them understand there's no way for our borrower to deal with this loan in a traditional sense. It's just not a possibility, really. And so when you mentioned the amounts of debt that people have, we do have a lot of attorneys as clients, and they are usually in the lower six figures. I think our highest has been 1,100,000. And
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
and his story was he was a neurosurgeon, and he was at the very end of his career. And what he had done is he'd taken out his own loans, he'd paid them back, and he'd taken out Parent Plus loans for his three children. Now they had their own loans, so they had a lot of loans that they used to go through medical school, but he had Parent Plus loans too. And so with all the years of forbearance, the balance kept getting bigger and bigger. And so when he did make payments, it never really made much of a dent. So when we did the math, he probably paid the vast majority of the principal back, but he still owed $1 million. And so he came to me, and he was in his early 70s. He was still working as a neurosurgeon, and he was afraid
Wow.
that he couldn't settle it because he'd have this giant taxable event. And he was worried he couldn't keep working because he was afraid he might commit malpractice one day. And so we use what we call this total and permanent disability program. And we were able to get rid of the loans in about, I think it was around 8 months or so. And, that let him basically end his career and enjoy retirement, where he was stuck. He was really stuck where he was when he first reached out to us. So 1,000,001 is my record.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you shared that story in particular, because I think a lot of people tend to think of student loans as being, okay, this is Gen Z and
Right. A
young
millennial.
millennials, right? They're thinking that are having this problem. I don't understand why they don't work. And and of course, those of us who are actually boots on the ground talking to people all the time about this, we understand that, we're talking people in their 30s and 40s and on up. The article I just posted that was discussed recently on Facebook were people in their 60s and 70s, and their parents, grandparents who co-signed on loans, who were helping out their kids, and really not able to retire. But I'm really concerned about this group kind of in their 30s and 40s, because in addition to their own loans, they're getting married, and they're marrying somebody else's debt. So that's another way that debt can really spiral out of control. You've got your debt, they've got their debt. You're paying these really, high interest rates. It was a ridiculous amount to begin with, and and then you're putting it all together and going, oh gosh, how do we deal with this? It delays buying a house, it delays starting a family, it delays all those things that impact the economy. Are you seeing a lot of couples kind of come in and say, hey, what can we do about this?
Well, we've seen folks that say I'm scared to get married, and they just put the decision off. So we generally won't have a couple that comes in to talk about each of their loans. We'll have someone that just avoids marriage because of that, and that's what.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And that a big impact that has on somebody's life, to make the decision to not get married or not get that much involved with them because you're worried about the amount of money, or you don't want to marry into somebody who's also got the same amount of money, married to somebody, or you're maybe ashamed or embarrassed about it. Do you deal with a lot of sort of shame and embarrassment for people, especially highly educated people, right?
Well, yes. I mean, many of our clients are attorneys. We did a seminar recently for the Florida Bar on student loans, a couple of them actually, and it had the highest attendance because, attorneys have a lot of debt, and they're ashamed of it, yes, but they really are talking with me trying to find a solution. They don't look to me as more of a counselor. They're looking to me more of a problem solver. And
Mm-hmm.
so our conversation just goes in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Many times they don't want their parents' credit affected if they've co-signed something. So we're trying to, make sure that doesn't happen. We're focusing on certain loans in a certain order to avoid that. because they don't want their problem to become their family's problem. We do see that.
Right,
Yeah.
for
But
sure.
but for people that want to build their wealth, they really need to have an ownership interest in their firm and maybe get out and start their own firm. And student loan debt is causing them to not do that or feel that they can't do that. And that's where the problem, I think, really stems. So I'm very happy about some of the new progress the Department of Ed has made this year. We had identified just so many problems over the last few years. And I think that what they're doing is plugging a lot of those holes. And we'll get to some of that later here.
Yeah,
But there's a
yeah.
lot of hope for people in the future, I think.
Before we get into kind of some of these solutions, I do want to talk, and I think a lot of people, if they have student loan debt, they're sort of aware of this, but bankruptcy, fresh start bankruptcy is has always been something that's been a solution in the United States for, so that we don't go to debtor's prison. People can get that fresh start and start over, but student loans have been an exception to that. Can you tell us why that is?
Sure. In student loans, we have a test called the Bruner Standard. And it originated back in, I think it was 1987. And it was basically someone who would try to discharge their loans only a few months out of school. And because of the facts of that case, the courts came down very harshly and created this three-pronged test that folks can't meet. And you have to minimize your expenses, which is not hard, maximize your income, again, not hard, provide proof of good faith repayment when you can. But then that prong of for whatever your circumstances are, they have to last for the majority of the repayment period. That prong is impossible to prove. You can't prove nowadays that in 20 years you can't pay back something towards this loan. You can write a book. You can have any kind of gig on side gig, regular job, whatever it is. And so we can't meet that burden. We can't prove that. And so bankruptcy, it's known that it fixes a car problem, it fixes a house problem, fixes a credit card problem, but it really creates more of a student loan problem. Because over the past decade or 2 decades, what's happened is folks with student loans, the Department of Ed puts those loans in forbearance. People don't file an adversary to try to get rid of the loans because it's very hard to meet that Bruner standard that I talked about. And so the loans just continue to ride through the bankruptcy, unaffected, accruing interest. So if you might have 50,000 when you start, you have 100,000 when you get out. Then you have a few years of no contact, add another 50,000. And so we brought that to the attention of our judges in the Middle District here in Tampa. And we also combined that with an inspector general's report that showed that servicers gave improper advice 62% of the time. Whatever it is that they were doing, whether they were calculating the interest, putting someone in a program, they did it wrong 62% of the time. And as an attorney, if I were wrong 62% of the time, I'd be disbarred. I mean,
yeah, you lose your license for sure, for sure.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, that's a whole nother episode of, let's talk about banks and lenders.
Yeah.
And what that is, because that whole industry needs to be reformed. Let's put it that way.
And so we were instrumental in helping the Middle District judges recognize that they can't just rely on the servicers. And there's this problem out there of this continuing debt that's getting bigger and bigger. And bankruptcy attorneys weren't talking about it because they didn't understand student loans, a few years back. And so our district started a new program called Student Loan Management Program. And it's been copied around the nation a little bit, and it's growing, momentum. And so what it does is it allows someone to get the benefits that a borrower would normally have in bankruptcy that they didn't get over the past few years. And so that's been helpful. But then Congress does have a bill that's before them called the Fresh Start Act, coincidentally, where if it passes or some combination of factors does pass, it would have a 10-year period where people who had been trying to repay for 10 years and could show that would have an automatic discharge because then they didn't have to bring an adversary and things. So that may pass. I mean, there's been attempts over the past years to try to get that passed. Right now, with all the forgiveness that's occurring, Congress has kind of taken a step back. They're starting to vote against things. So I give that less of a chance of success now than I might have a few months ago.
Wow.
Yeah, but you just never know. I mean, you never know with Congress.
Right. And there's also a big distinction between federal loans and private loans. And I think a lot of times it can be confusing for people to know what type of loan they have, because as you're going through school and you may have, this opportunity to consolidate these loans and you think it's still a federal loan, and then you find out later that it's a private loan. I do think there's a lot of, um, uh, it's a complex thing to understand what's really happening if you're not an economist, you're not a banker, you're not a lender, and even if you are, apparently you're having trouble understanding it. At least 62% of them are. Because I've seen that a lot too, where people think I have a federal loan, I'm going to benefit from this, recent act, and then they look at their loans and they go, wait a minute. Now my servicer is telling me, no, I have this class of loan, not that class of loan, which means at some point it was consolidated. And when that happened, they took it out of federal status. So I now no longer benefit from it. How much do you see those kind of complications? And are there more things you can do in terms of bankruptcy if you have private loans versus federal loans, or how does all that sort of play out depending on what type of loan you have?
Okay. I see that problem every day, pretty much, with the different types of loans. And part of the problem is even the federal system is a little bit confusing. For one, it's not transparent. So it's very hard for someone to figure out what they have. Lately, there's been more information put up on studentaid.gov, which is a government site, and folks can see. But part of the problem is servicers are talking about these older federal loans as being a private loan, and they're really not. They're privately held, and they may have been privately originated, but they're actually a federal loan. But they're only guaranteed by the government. They're not actually owned or created by the government, so therefore they're not covered by the CARES Act. The CARES Act is what was passed at the beginning of COVID that allowed for zero interest, zero payments, and so forth. So we have a lot of folks who, during COVID, they haven't really known what they've had, and they haven't been able to consolidate to change their loan type, which is one of the things that you can do. And a lot of folks don't know to do that. So we do see that problem all the time. With bankruptcy, the second part of your question about can you get rid of private loans in bankruptcy, that is one of our great successes. In the past few years, there have been some cases around the nation, and some of ours have been up in the forefront about discharging private loans that are actually not student loans. They're not qualified education loans. Maybe someone went to a Caribbean medical school. There's a ton of Caribbean medical schools. I once looked it up, and there's like 50 schools down there. And
Wow.
3 of them are eligible for federal aid. Most of the rest are funded by family money, someone pays cash, or a private loan. Well, we can discharge the vast majority of those. And many of those folks can't pass their boards. They incur all this debt. They try to come back to the US and they can't be licensed. And so I think that's a huge benefit for folks to be able to level the playing field, to get rid of those loans, potentially because they're not qualified. There's other reasons to have a non-qualified education loans. I won't get into it today, but there's about 7, 8 different reasons. And so just yesterday, for instance, we have one that was filed out of state with co-counsel, and we have 3 defendants, one of which just agreed to a stipulation of discharge of their private student loan debt, and then we're going to wait and see what the results are for the other 2. So we can, basically argue things for private loans to get them discharged in bankruptcy that we can't with federal loans.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And I do think there's a lot of misinformation that's being, if you go to your servicer and you try to get information, it's not really always reliable information that you may be getting, right?
Yeah, and one of the ways we actually ask our clients to back check that, call their servicer 4 or 5 times. They're likely to get 3 or 4 answers. One of them might be right, but which one?
And that's where you got to do some digging. So let's talk about some of the kind of solutions for people that you guys are able to bring about and help with. And we can start with kind of things that are traditionally have been on the table, or we can talk about sort of the stuff that's been happening in the last year.
Well, probably let's focus on some of the things that have been happening in the last year, because that's where people have the biggest questions is all these changes they're hearing about in the news. How does it benefit me? And so I think that's where their focus is. So first of all, that $10,000 forgiveness, that's what we hear a lot about. That's not very much money. It could help some of the lower income folks because it would remove the default that might be on their loans currently. But we're more focused on the Department of Ed's attempts to plug the holes, fix the problems that they've got in the other programs. And there'll be a lot more forgiveness with those fixes than there will with the 10,000 thing.
Wow, really? So give me some
Yeah.
idea what that would look like. What
Okay.
kinds of things are you guys fighting for?
Sure. Well, the first thing is if you have any folks that are in public service or have any relatives who are in public service, that's the biggest fix. It's basically the public service waiver, which is going to count old payments on old loans, whether they're the wrong type of loans, wrong type of payment, any kind of problem that they've had, usually it can be fixed with this waiver program. But it's important that they do two things before October 31. One is make sure that they consolidate any of their older federal loans, which are called FEL loans, FFEL. It stands for Federal Family Education Loan, but they're called FEL or FELP. If they consolidate those to direct loans, they'll be eligible for that program. If they don't do that before October 31, then it's going to go right back to the old way, where people who've been working public service, expecting the forgiveness in 10 years are only told that, oh, you've got the wrong loan type. You were never eligible to begin with. That was a huge problem. And it's going to go back to being the same problem after this 1 year is over. And the 1 year is almost over now. It ends October 31. So they need to consolidate to direct. They also need to file a public service certification. Basically, you take a form to your employer, they fill it out saying you're full-time, you work for a qualifying entity, and then you send it into Mohila, who's the new public service servicer. That's fixing a huge problem. And, importantly, there was an attorney I spoke with a few weeks ago. It's a good example of this. This was someone who makes pretty good money right now, but they had been working public service for the vast majority of their career. And so their student loan was huge because they thought that it was going to be forgiven at the end of their public service, and it wasn't. But they now had their head in the sand because they were so sick of the whole student loan program, the whole problem. Their loans were 300 some thousand. They were a little older, and it might have even been more than that. I can't remember the exact number. But we went through their circumstances and found out that they're going to be eligible for this waiver. They just need to make sure that they apply for it and change their loan type to qualify. He hadn't even, the only reason he reached out to me was because a friend of his demanded that they call me.
Wow.
And, because we'd helped the friend and he did. And so we were able to, suggest to him during a consultation what to do. And, that's one of the advantages of having a consultation is that you can either, learn how to fix it yourself and know exactly, you're hearing from an advocate on your side as to what you should do, or you can hire that person and then they can go and fix it for you. But that public service waiver program, he didn't have to go back to work for the public service. A lot of folks still today think that, well, that waiver program isn't for me because I'm no longer working public service. Maybe I did in the 90s or 2000s, but not anymore. You don't have to go back. One of the provisions of the waiver is you don't have to be working there. But the regular program requires you to still be working for the nonprofit. So these fixes in the last year have limited durations, and public service is one of them. The second one is folks during the past decade or so, they've been told if they call their servicer and say, oh, I've got a problem making my payment. I've had this and that problem this month. Instead of putting them on an income-driven plan, which is kind of what we do for someone who doesn't make enough money to repay their student loans and maintain a standard of living, they just put them on forbearance instead. And forbearance is basically an easy fix. It's a way that someone cannot make a payment. It's also a way to get them off the phone faster. And so some servicers have been accused of, paying incentives to their customer service reps for short call durations. Well, how do you get someone off the phone? You don't tell them about all these different things they can do. You just give them forbearance. And so it's been a long-standing problem. You have a loan that's been $50,000 that's now $150,000. And so the IDR waiver and audit program that was announced in April requires someone to consolidate their loans to direct loans by the end of this year. So this deadline is December 31. So it's instead of October 31, it's December 31. And it allows for someone to get credit for those long forbearances that they might have had. And that credit then can be applied towards forgiveness. The other thing that's coming out is a new income-driven plan. So we have some folks who they make pretty good income, right? They're owners of their firm or they work somewhere where they're at the top higher level and they're making six figures. but they might help care for their parents, or they might have some, expenses that are high. One of the problems with the current income-driven plans is that it's a percentage of that income, and it doesn't take into account specialized expenses, no matter how legitimate they might be. And so the payment is too high, so they end up defaulting. Well, there's a new income-driven plan coming out in July that's going to be 5% of someone's income, discretionary earnings, and then they're using a more broad test for expenses. So I think that's going to fix one of those last holes that we have, which is folks that have high expenses, can't make an income-driven plan. They're going to be able to do that now. There's some other fixes with respect to just overall things like the accrual of interest, the capitalization of interest. There's some internal fixes that are going to make it so the balances don't get so high. Because remember where I mentioned that folks come to us, they generally understand that they've signed a contract and they owe the money. They just can't handle all the excessive craziness that's gone on. And that's where,
I mean, it is insane when you hear people say, I have already paid off the amount that I borrowed and I still owe $300,000. And
yeah,
I mean, that to me is just sickening. It's sickening.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back. You mentioned something about forbearance, and I just want to, I think a lot of times people bury their head in the sand about this and they don't really think about, so you talk to a servicer and they go, I'm at a point where I can't pay my loan, whatever circumstances have happened, and I can't pay anymore. And they say, okay, well, let's just put you in forbearance, or let's do deferment, or let's talk a little bit about the financial consequence of that. Because
Sure.
I've seen that happen over and over again. And people are later on, years later, they're like, oh my God, what did I do? When they go to try to buy a house, when they go to try to do something, they
Yes.
start to see the consequences of that. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of what the consequences are of doing those things?
Sure. So the servicers really haven't been giving caps on someone's ability to use forbearance. And it's just gone on for years. And so what happens when someone goes on forbearance, they don't have a payment, but the interest still accrues. And at the end of the forbearance period, which is usually a year, that interest then it tacks on to the original principal balance, and it has a compounding effect. So now they're paying interest on interest. It's not simple interest, it's that compounding effect. And so just like Warren Buffett, where if you save, I think, $50 a week at age whatever, by the time you're 65, you have $1 million kind of thing. It works in the exact opposite for someone with a student loan. And then with all the scams going on, you have folks that accidentally default. They don't realize that, oh, this new company has my loans. They're the servicer. They ignore them. Then they accidentally default and they add 25% to the balance. So you have that accrual of interest. You have an accidental default. And you have that going on for years. Pretty soon, you have an enormous amount of money to repay. The other thing about buying a home is that mortgage underwriters have traditionally, if someone's on forbearance, they count their student loan payment, if they were making it, as 1% of the overall balance. So that means someone who has a $300,000 loan, if they went to apply for a mortgage, the underwriter is going to assume they have a $3,000 student loan payment. Well, that means they're not going to be able to afford that house probably.
Right.
And so that's the harm that forbearance has. And if someone defaults, then they go on CAVERS, which is the mortgage underwriting default system that they can track that. So forbearance, while it sounds like an immediate fix, there's no paperwork required, you can get no payment very quickly, it's a trap. It really is. It should be used only for someone for a short-term problem, like a car accident where they're unable to work for a period of time. It should never be a long-term solution. It's not a solution of any kind. But this audit program is designed to give a 1-year credit towards folks who have a direct loan. And remember, you can consolidate an older loan to be a direct loan and to kind of get credit for those long-term forbearances. There's certain things that they look for. It has to be cumulative more than 3 years or consecutive more than a year. But you can use that in combination with public service. So we have folks that are contacting us that can get an immediate forgiveness without doing anything further other than the paperwork to get these things. And some of the things are automatic. Some of it requires paperwork, like even the $10,000 thing. That seems simple, right? But there's an income cap, which means only those that make less than 125,000 or 250 married will get it, and only those with loans that are held by the Department of Ed. So you still have to take some action. You have to let the Department of Ed know how much your income is. Well, during COVID, no one had to do that, right? So they don't know. So there's going to be this application out around the first part of October that people can, we don't know what the application is going to say yet, but I imagine one of the first things is going to be what's your income. And they're looking at the 2020 and 2021 period. And you're going to want to drop that basically to be eligible for that. And it's $20,000 if someone has a Pell Grant. And Pell Grants are something that's not understood a lot. People think, well, how is the $10,000 or $20,000 applied to my Pell Grant? Well, you don't repay a Pell Grant. It's a grant. It's just a way for the government to track its lower income folks. And so that's why if someone had gotten a Pell Grant, that usually meant that their family was a lower income, they qualified for that grant, and now they'll get a $20,000 instead. But there's things you have to do. You have to file the application. If you had paid during COVID, you can file something to ask for a refund, even if you'd refinance your loans. And here's one of the lesser known things. If you'd refinanced your loan during COVID, that's payment by a third party. That is something that you can get a refund for up to the 10 or possibly 20,000 if you ask for it in a certain way. So some things are automatic and some things you have to take a few steps to get.
Oh, wow. So if you're sitting there with your multi six-figure loans and you feel defeated because all of this stuff is just more confusing than ever, let's talk about some resources for people. Obviously, the biggest resource is go hire an attorney who specializes in student loans because that just makes sense. If you're sitting on six figures, multiple, even not, it doesn't even have to be six figures, because I know people who've been, had 5-figure loans and it's taken years and years and years to pay them off. So, seeing an attorney, but let's talk about some of the things that you have available, because I know you have first of all, you've taught many CLEs on this, and you have a wonderful YouTube channel. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So we have a YouTube channel that I call the Student Loan Sidebar. And we created that because videos seem to be where people want to get a lot of information. They can do it in between appointments and such. The name originated from a publication that we do, a column in our local bankruptcy cram down newsletter. And so for that, we provided in writing the different things that they should be aware of for their clients or for their own loans each quarter. And that's available on our homepage of our website, which is christiearkovich.com. And so you can go to the cram down sidebar and read what you like, or the videos. If you just Google Arkovich Law YouTube, it comes right up. And so we try to do videos that are somewhere between 2 and 10 minutes that talk about whatever recent announcement, how someone can qualify, when their loans are eligible, and if there's anything they need to do. And the reason why I do that is because if you see that something's passed or about to pass, sometimes the title of the article might be more clickbait than anything. And I remember getting into an argument with one woman who was a nurse, and she was absolutely convinced that this public service waiver thing was going to get rid of her loans entirely. But there were some reasons why she was partially eligible and not completely. And she didn't know that. From the article, the newscaster had just covered just the generic kind of top line and didn't get into the specifics. And so with the YouTube channel, we try to get into those specifics just a little bit more, but they're still easy to understand. And so that's free information that folks can go on and see. We also give seminars for the Florida Bar and some other things, some podcasts and such about different topics. That might include the Joint Spousal Consolidation Act. That's going to be our next video. The House has passed it. The Senate has passed it. President Biden is expected to sign it probably within the next 2 weeks. And it's to allow those who went to school and later got married, those folks consolidated their loans. And the problem with that is that they can't unconsolidate. And they consolidate it into an older loan type. And what happens is they're trapped in that program. It's kind of a one way in, no way out kind of situation. And so they're not eligible for any of this new stuff. And so this fix is basically to unwind that. And that's been a beef of ours for a number of years. And we've obtained a similar result in bankruptcy through an adversary proceeding, but now people can get it much cheaper and much faster with this law change that we expect. So we'll do a video on that. Our videos usually come out a few days after the announcement, or maybe a day or two, just so we have enough time to digest it. Think about.
Well, I'm sure there are people who are going to go there now and just binge. We'll include the link in the show notes so people can do that. That's maybe what if you're in Florida and you're getting through the hurricane and you're hunkering down, maybe you'll be binging on Christie.
Right, maybe binging videos.
Doing it.
And then we have a lot of folks who they're okay with the videos, but they want to know exactly what to do with their loans. And it's a time versus money thing. If our consultation fee isn't that much for the amount of money they owe, they might want to have us do a one-on-one consultation just to see, if we can, what they need to do and what we can do for them. And so for that, we waive our fee if they hire us. And then number two, sometimes we can tell them what they need to do in that half hour, and then they can do it themselves. Many of our clients are attorneys and they're able to do that. And then three, if we just spend 5 minutes and we find that they're doing everything that they can do, then we don't end up charging them. So that's what we call as our consultation guarantee. We do charge for every consultation. We used to do them for free. We stopped that a number of years ago. We really can't afford to do that. But I think it's a valuable, piece of information. It's not much money. And unfortunately, the amount of these loans, it's often the price of a house. They're dealing with a large student loan. And these fixes are going to go away. That deadline I mentioned of October 31, December 31, once those deadlines pass, it's going to go to the old way, the old system, because the reason these fixes are in place is because the current administration has used this HEROES Act to basically say there's a public emergency and we can do this. And that might raise a question with some of our attorneys, is that what is legal? How much of this is legal that they're doing?
Right.
Well, it's questionable because now we have President Biden saying that there's no pandemic. The pandemic is over. Well, is the state of emergency still here then to effectuate some of these changes? So I'd encourage people to get in there and get these changes done, get the forgiveness, because it's impossible to unwind that. But there's a very strong possibility of some of these things going away earlier than anticipated if the support is not behind them. And then you'll have two classes of folks. You'll have folks that have already gotten the relief, the forgiveness. You'll have other ones that are pending that may or may not get it because there's years of litigation over whether or not it was legal for the administration to do this via executive order versus an act of Congress. So, that's a whole nother topic.
Right. So this is really one of those situations where if this has been in the back of your mind, now it's time to bring it to the forefront and make an appointment with an attorney who handles student loans to really see what your options are. And for me, you always hear me advising my clients, don't DIY. Through the years, I have hired so many lawyers who specialize in different areas of practice. Yes, I could go figure things out. Yes, I could research. But when time is of the essence, you really want to make sure, and in something as complicated as this, I do think it is really would behoove people to go talk to somebody that this is what they do all day, every day, because they're going to know a lot of these nuances and a lot of these things. Christie has just dropped an absolute wealth of information here, and you might have to listen to this 2 or 3 times to really understand the full impact of all of it. So I do think that's important. Let me ask you this: is a student loan, since you're dealing with federal loans and things like that, is this something where you help people in other states, or is this are you limited to Florida?
For private loans, we limit ourselves to Florida unless we have co-counsel that works with us, which we do in those private discharge cases. For federal loans, we can do things nationwide generally. And so one of our more successful programs is that disability program, where if someone can't work full-time doing what they used to do, we have an occupational medicine specialist that works with us, and we typically can get discharges. So that would be nationwide there. So a little bit of both, basically.
Yeah. I've known one person I went to law school with who had a very serious disability that did not allow her to practice law shortly after she graduated. And it took her years to get that resolved, but fortunately she was able to. And I have another friend that I graduated from law school with who, by the time she was done, she owed about $350,000, and she started a nonprofit. She says, I started a nonprofit. If I work a certain amount in this nonprofit, then I'm eligible for, I guess, that public service.
Yeah, 10 years. So if you have 10 years of working for a qualified nonprofit, then you would be forgiven of the remaining balance, and that was also tax-free.
Yeah. So there are those, and that is a very creative solution that a lot of people probably wouldn't think about. And so
Right.
I think that's where there's also a benefit to talking with an attorney who kind of specializes in this area, because there is a lot of creative solutions to get. And I think you have to pull out all the stops in trying to be creative and figure these things out, because I think this system was built deliberately to be kind of a quagmire, because the banks and lenders, they're making the money. They're making a lot of money on this, because so many people are attempting to pay, and they're paying years and years of interest, even ones who eventually may have something in forbearance or default on it or whatever.
Well, one of our primary arguments for discharging private loans is actually kind of like that. It's a predatory type of situation where in 2005 and 6, the bankruptcy code was amended to basically give protection to private loans similar to federal student loans. And so there's a lot of private lenders out there that sent out marketing material and said, do this, do that, buy a car, do whatever it is with your money. We have this for you. And they wanted to basically have their funds be counted as a student loan. And they were really nothing more than a consumer loan. They had a high rate of interest. They had a co-borrower. But since they were considered a student loan, they were non-dischargeable. And in fact, that's where some of the recent case law has come out to say that it's not dischargeable. I mean, not non-dischargeable. That's too many negatives,
Right.
but
That it could be dischargeable.
yeah, it could be dischargeable. And so there's a lot of, help in that area. But the transparency of the system is horrible. I've done multiple areas of law throughout my 30-year practice, and I have to say that student loans is the most confusing out there. Right now, there's contradictory information out there because we have the old programs, then we have the new fixes that are temporary, usually lasting within a few months or a year here. Then it's going to go back to the old program. So we have folks who believe that they shouldn't consolidate now because none of their earlier payments will count. Well, under these fixes, there's a one-time waiver where it will count, but the old information is still out there and it will be accurate again come next year. And so that's confusing to folks because
you cannot count on your servicer to give you accurate information.
Really
also, I think one of the things that's really complicated this process a lot, we saw this I represented lenders in foreclosure around the recession. So 2007, 8, all those years there. And so much of the complexity of that you see in here is those loans getting sold. So your servicer changes over time too. And as things change, that also can have an impact on what you're seeing and understanding and believing, all of that as well, because you may not be getting accurate information. If something has been sold several times, a lot can happen.
Right.
In the process of something being sold and how things are categorized or whatever. So it's really important to, dig deep and understand it and get help doing that.
You also have a bit of a deer in the headlights. I once wanted to change my billing program, but all the different options out there, there were advantages and disadvantages, and so I just didn't make a decision. I had too much information, and so that's out there too, where it's just too much information. Folks will look at it, they don't have time, they don't want to get back to it, and then they don't make a decision, which is a decision in and of itself to remain exactly the same. So
and I think that's a wonderful point. I cannot stress enough how this decision, if your goal is to be wealthy and live a rich life, this decision, you may think I can ignore this right now and just do whatever, and I'm just not going to deal with it. But one day something is going to happen that's going to force you to have to deal with it, and it's probably not going to be pretty. So now, if this is something you've been hiding from and burying your head in the sand over, now is the time. And don't try to do it yourself if it feels overwhelming. Go get somebody who knows what they're talking about, who does this for a living, who is not overwhelmed by it because it's not their personal thing, and ask them to help and pay them to help you. And you'll wind up saving just thousands and thousands and thousands in the long run, most likely. So,
and I wanted to mention one other thing. Anyone who has not paid on a private loan, if you do a settlement on any remaining balance, first of all, there's a lot of things you should look at to see whether it's dischargeable. But once you're done with that, if you do settle it before the end of 2025, the result would be tax-free. So if you get a settlement where you're paying 40 cents on the dollar or something like that, and 60% is being waived, you don't get a tax bill on the rest of that if you can get it done before December 31 of 2025. So it's a few years down the road, but it's only around the corner basically with a settlement. Yeah. So
for
the
sure.
reason I reached out to offer this information on student loans is because minimizing those personal expenses is huge towards building your wealth, but minimizing firm expenses is important too. And so one of the things I've done with my office is we've gone remote. Since March of 2020, we went ahead and went remote, and we decided we like it, and we're going to keep it up. We still have our office for when we need it. And so we're offering our office as workspaces for those attorneys who you're working at home too. You're in Tampa maybe. And so, but you only need an office on a sometimes basis. So we have it as South Tampa workspaces. If anyone out there wants to reach out to us, I'd love to have a chance to talk with them too.
Wonderful. I think there are a lot of people out there who are looking for those kinds of solutions right now where they really don't need an office on a regular basis, but they like to have that place where they can meet clients if they need to do that. And Zoom doesn't work for them anymore, or even just to get out of the house and go someplace and work. Because I know a lot of people have little kids at home, and even if they have a dedicated workspace, they may want that place they can do that. So wonderful resource there in South Tampa. So we need to end, but tell us how people can get in touch with you. You mentioned your YouTube channel, but tell us other ways they can get in touch with you if they want to.
So our email is info@christiearchivage.com. And our phone number is 813-258-2808. And then if you go on our website, there's, of course, the contact me forms. We have a blog also that I pretty regularly publish things that have come out. And then the YouTube channel is Archivage Law. YouTube comes right up.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here, Christie. I think this has been hugely helpful, and a lot of people hopefully will take this to heart and really take action on dealing with these student loans. I know the temptation for people is to just not think about it, but really, truly, if you want to build the kind of wealth that you say you want, then this is something that does have to be handled, because this can take everything away, really. It can have that kind of impact on somebody's life. So as the case when you mentioned your 70-year-old client, I mean, this is no joke, these student loans. So, and we see that the government is going to be, a limited resource in how they help us get out of this. So do reach out to a lawyer. If you're in Florida, reach out to Christie for sure. And thanks so much for being here, Christie. I so appreciate it. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. And your podcasts are wonderful, by the way. I've listened to a few others over the years and have really learned some things that have helped me in my practice. So
thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode of the Wealthy Woman Lawyer podcast. If you have, we invite you to leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. The more 5-star reviews we have, the more women law firm owners will be able to positively impact. Your thoughts and opinions are so important to us. If you are a woman law firm owner who wants to scale your law firm to $1 million or more in gross annual revenue and do it in a way that's sustainable and feels good to you, then we invite you to join us in the Wealthy Woman Lawyer League. The League is a community of highly intelligent, goal-oriented, and driven women law firm owners who are excited to support one another on their journeys to becoming wealthy women lawyers. We'll be sharing so much in the League in the coming year, including the exclusive $1 Million Law Firm Framework that until now I've only shared with my private one-to-one clients. For more information and to join us, go now to www.wealthywomanlawyer.com/league. That's www.wealthywomanlawyer.com/league. League is spelled LEAGUE. We look forward to seeing you soon in the League.